They made me eat leftovers from the dog bowl, on Thanksgiving, no less. The table was set with all the usual trappings. The crisp white linens embroidered with delicate autumn leaves, the silverware polished to a dull gleam, the pumpkin pie steaming on its porcelain plate, and the scent of roasted turkey mingling with cinnamon and cloves in the warm air. But my plate was nowhere to be found. Instead, my son-in-law, a man I had once trusted to be respectful, grinned at me with a kind of cruel amusement I had never seen before and said, "There's plenty left in the bowl," as if I were a stray dog who had no right to a seat at the table or the dignity that comes with it. The bowl he referred to was the plastic dog bowl, scuffed and dented, sitting on the floor in the corner of the kitchen where the family dog usually ate. I looked around the room expecting someone, anyone, to stop this madness, to speak up for me, but the room was thick with silence, punctuated only by the quiet clinking of forks and the polite murmur of other family members. My daughter Bethany was sitting next to him, her face fixed in a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't say a word. No one did. It was as if I had become invisible overnight, or worse, an object of mockery disguised as a joke. I could feel my cheeks burning, but the tears refused to come. Or maybe I just refused to let them fall. I turned away slowly and made my way to the guest room, a small, cold space at the end of the hall where I had been relegated to sleep for the weekend. I closed the door behind me and pressed my face into a clean towel, sobbing silently, as though I were trying to swallow the shame whole. I'm 81 years old now, and I live in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of a town so small that most of my family doesn't even know it exists. It's a quiet place, surrounded by scrub pine and wildflowers, with a porch that creaks under the weight of decades and windows that catch the morning light just right. I keep a few cats, strays mostly, who come and go as they please. And in the evenings, I cook for myself. I cook slowly, with care, using recipes I've held on to for years, some scribbled in a fading notebook that belonged to my mother before me. My kitchen smells of rosemary and roast chicken, not of bitterness or regret. I have not spoken to Bethany in over 3 years now, and yet the echoes of that night, the humiliation and the cold dismissal, still follow me like a shadow I can never quite outrun. When people ask me how I came to be here, in this small, peaceful house, I tell them it's a story of being pushed to the edge and finding my way back from there. But the truth is far messier. It is a story of betrayal wrapped in the thin veneer of family gatherings, of a role quietly stripped away piece by piece until there was nothing left but a dog bowl and silence. Thanksgiving used to be my favorite holiday, a day I looked forward to all year, where the house buzzed with laughter and the clatter of plates, where my children and grandchildren gathered around a table overflowing with food and stories. I spent hours in the kitchen cooking until my hands ached, crafting dishes that had been passed down for generations: sweet potato casserole, green beans with toasted almonds, homemade stuffing, and I took pride in the way the house smelled, warm and inviting like a sanctuary. But that year, something shifted so completely that it felt as though the foundation beneath me had been pulled out without warning. The invitation had come, as usual, weeks before, with Bethany's clipped, overly polite voice on the phone, reminding me to bring my famous cranberry relish and offering a special spot in the guest room that had been freshly cleaned just for me. I told myself it was just a family gathering, that old tensions could be set aside for the day, that this was my family and I belonged there. I wore my best sweater, the one my mother knitted for me in a soft shade of moss green, and I packed my favorite cookbook just in case. But from the moment I stepped through the front door, I could feel the cold eyes on me, the barely concealed sighs and quick glances exchanged when I wasn't looking. It was as if I were a stranger passing through a house that had once been mine. The day passed in a blur of forced smiles and clipped conversation. I was asked to help set the table, to fetch drinks, to clear plates, but never once was I invited to sit down with the others. When the time came for dessert, I waited for my slice of pie like everyone else, But instead, my son-in-law's words sliced through the room, cutting away any pretense of kindness or family loyalty. "There's plenty left in the bowl," he said again, louder this time, with a wink that was met by chuckles and knowing looks from the younger generation. I realized then that this was no accident, no thoughtless cruelty. It was a calculated dismissal, a statement of my place in their carefully curated world. I was no longer a mother or grandmother. I was a punchline, a relic to be humored or ignored. I could have stood up, shouted, made a scene, but something inside me had already retreated, folded in on itself like the pages of an old book no one wanted to read anymore. I slipped away to the guest room, the echoes of laughter trailing after me like a taunt. That night, I lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of the family downstairs, their voices carrying faintly through the walls like ghosts of a life I used to know. I thought about the years spent raising children, the countless meals prepared, the nights spent soothing scrapes and broken hearts. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the hours of overtime at work, the money lent without question, the birthdays remembered and celebrated, the holidays orchestrated to perfection. And I thought about the emptiness that had replaced all of it, the cold absence where love and respect should have been. I realized with a quiet and terrible clarity that this was what it meant to be forgotten by those you once held closest. It was not a loud betrayal, but a slow erasure, a fading into the background until you no longer mattered. Since that night, I have built a new kind of life, one that is not defined by the approval or recognition of my family, but by the quiet dignity I have reclaimed for myself. I have learned to cook for myself and savor my meals in solitude, to walk the streets of this small town with my head held high, to open my door to the stray cats who have become my companions and confidants. I have discovered that freedom comes not from the presence of others, but from the absence of those who diminish you. This house with its creaking floors and wild garden is mine in every sense that matters. Here, I am no longer invisible, no longer a punchline or an afterthought. I am simply me, an old woman who remembers who she is and refuses to be diminished again. The road to this place has been long and winding, marked by pain and silence, but it has brought me here, to a quiet peace I had almost forgotten was possible. And so I tell you this story not for pity or sympathy, but because if you have ever been made to feel less than, cast aside like yesterday's news or someone's inconvenient obligation, you are not alone. There is a way out of the shadows, a way back to yourself that does not require the approval of those who have turned away. It is a path that begins with the refusal to accept the scraps offered from a dog bowl and the courage to serve your own table, no matter how small or humble, with the respect you deserve. This is where my story begins. This is where I found my voice again. The moment that changed everything was not sudden, like a thunderclap, but slow and deliberate, like the creeping chill of winter settling into the bones of a house long neglected. It began the moment I arrived at Bethany's for the Thanksgiving gathering, carrying my carefully packed dishes and a heart full of hope that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. The house was bustling with energy, children running through the halls, the hum of conversations in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans mixing with laughter that sometimes felt strained, but was there nonetheless. I smiled as I entered, greeting faces both familiar and distant, but there was an undercurrent I could not ignore, a tension woven through the room like an invisible thread pulling tighter with every passing minute. I watched as my place in the family shifted from honored guest to tolerated spectator, and then finally to something else entirely, an inconvenience, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. Bethany, my daughter, was always the one who held the family together, or so I thought. But that afternoon she moved through the rooms with a practiced ease that hid something brittle beneath the surface. Her smile was sharp-edged, rehearsed, and when she spoke to me, it was with a tone that was both distant and commanding, like a manager assigning tasks rather than a daughter welcoming her mother home. She handed me a tray of appetizers and said, "Can you help me set this out in the living room? We want everything perfect before everyone arrives." There was no invitation to sit, no question about my comfort or what I might want. Instead, I was set to work, a ghost flitting between rooms, visible only because I was needed but never truly seen. I arranged the plates carefully, making sure the deviled eggs looked symmetrical, the cheese tray artfully displayed, but my hands shook slightly as I realized that this was no longer my family's celebration. It was a performance in which I was no longer a player but an extra, waiting for a cue that would never come. The subtle erasure began long before the dog bowl incident, in the way conversations would hush when I entered a room, the way my name was mentioned only when necessary, and the way my opinions were met with polite nods but no real consideration. At the dinner table, my seat was moved to the far end, away from the center of conversation, as though my presence was a disruption to the carefully curated scene. I could feel eyes flicking away, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, and the quiet shuffling of feet as if everyone was waiting for me to disappear. My grandson, just 12 years old, leaned toward his father and whispered something that I caught out of the corner of my ear. "Why does Grandma always have to sit so far away?" The father's reply was a shrug and a muttered, "Just how it's always been." It was the first crack in the facade for me, a silent confirmation that the distance between us was no accident, but a design. That evening, after the main courses were cleared away and the pumpkin pie was being sliced, I asked where my plate was. I had expected, foolishly, that someone would have saved me a serving, or that I might be invited to join in with the others. Instead, my son-in-law, whose name I hesitate to say aloud because his actions have forever tarnished it in my memory, looked at me with a twisted grin and said, "There's plenty left in the bowl." His eyes glinted with mockery as he gestured toward the dog's food bowl sitting in the corner of the kitchen, a plastic dish scuffed and stained from years of use. The room went silent as if waiting to see how I would respond, but no one came to my defense. My daughter, Bethany, sat beside him, her smile fixed and fragile, as if she were trying to pretend this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But it wasn't. It was deliberate, a calculated act of cruelty disguised as humor. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. The shame and disbelief washed over me in waves, a tide that threatened to pull me under. I could have shouted, demanded respect, called out the injustice, but the years of quiet endurance and the weight of being unseen made me silent. Instead, I turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. Later, in the solitude of the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the tears fall, finally breaking the dam I had held back for so long. The room was small and cold, the only warmth coming from the fading light outside the window and the distant sounds of laughter from the kitchen that felt like a cruel reminder of everything I had lost. I thought about the years of devotion I had poured into this family, the meals cooked, the holidays planned, the countless sacrifices made without complaint, and how it all seemed to have been reduced to a cruel joke. I thought about the quiet days after my husband passed, when I had hoped that my children would cherish me as I aged, that they would see me as a woman worthy of love and respect, not a burden or an afterthought. But instead, I had been cast aside, mocked in my own home, and left to eat from a dog bowl. That night, the betrayal was a heavy blanket wrapped tightly around my shoulders, and the loneliness was a chasm so vast it seemed to swallow me whole. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my family was deafening. Calls went unanswered, texts ignored, invitations to gatherings stopped arriving. I learned of family events through the whisper of conversations caught on the street, or through social media posts where I was never mentioned, never included. The once warm and vibrant connections had withered to brittle threads, fragile and easily broken. When I dared to reach out, my concerns were dismissed as oversensitivity or imagined slights. Bethany told me with a voice that was both weary and sharp, "Mom, you're always making drama. Maybe it's time to stop." My other children remained silent, avoiding the uncomfortable conversations that might have acknowledged the rift growing between us. I felt the slow and steady erosion of my place in the family, a dismantling not with force, but with neglect, as though my presence was no longer welcome, but tolerated only out of habit. Yet even in the midst of this heartbreak, a spark of something stubborn and fierce remained within me. I began to realize that this betrayal, this deliberate exclusion, was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. It was the moment when I could choose whether to continue living in the shadows cast by those who no longer saw me, or to step into the light of my own making. I began to write down my memories, my feelings, the truth of my experience, not for them, but for myself. I started to gather the fragments of my dignity that had been scattered like leaves in the wind, and piece them back together with careful hands. The road ahead was uncertain, and the path would not be easy. But for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something I had forgotten: hope. After that Thanksgiving, when the echo of the dog bowl still rang in my ears and the cold weight of betrayal settled into the bones of my body, life didn't improve. It quietly worsened in ways that were almost imperceptible, as if the world had begun to shrink around me, closing in until I was left gasping for space. The sharp sting of that one night was just the first cut, a wound that opened slowly and bled in silence. I found myself slipping further from the life I had known, not through dramatic confrontations or loud fights, but by the steady erosion of presence and significance, until I was nothing more than a ghost haunting the edges of my own family's world. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that things would return to normal once the holidays passed, once the stress of family gatherings and busy schedules eased. But the phone calls began to taper off, the texts became infrequent, and the invitations stopped coming altogether. I sat by the window, watching the seasons change outside, waiting for the knock on the door that never came. The house, once filled with laughter and footsteps, grew quieter each day, and I learned to live with the silence like an old, unwelcome friend. My days blended into one another, a muted parade of routine and solitude, punctuated only by the soft purring of the cats who'd become my constant companions. They were the only ones who seemed to notice when I sat still for too long, who nudged my hand with gentle insistence, reminding me that I was still here, still alive, still deserving of warmth. The slow slide into invisibility was not marked by dramatic gestures, but by the absence of small kindnesses that once held meaning. My grandson's graduation came and went without a word. The pictures posted online showed smiling faces, proud parents and siblings celebrating together. But I was nowhere in the frame, nowhere in the story. When I asked my daughter about it, her voice was tight and careful. "It was a small ceremony, Mom. You wouldn't have enjoyed it." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I had dreamed of that day, that I had raised that boy with my own hands, that I deserved to be there. But the words caught in my throat, and instead I nodded quietly, swallowing the ache that had become a constant companion. The invitations to family dinners and birthdays dried up like leaves in the fall, and I found myself hearing about the gatherings only after they had happened, from neighbors or distant relatives who called out of pity or curiosity. When I reached out to my children, hoping for a conversation that might bridge the widening gulf, I was met with excuses and dismissals. "Mom, you're too sensitive," Bethany said once, as if my pain were a fault to be corrected rather than a wound to be healed. My calls went unanswered or were returned with clipped, distracted voices that made me feel like an interruption rather than a loved one. The quiet rejection was harder to bear than any harsh word, the feeling that I was no longer part of their lives except as a memory best forgotten. Amidst this growing isolation, I began to notice the ways in which my presence was actively diminished in everyday life. At family events I managed to attend, I was no longer asked to share stories or contribute opinions. Conversations moved around me as though I were a piece of furniture, seen but not heard, present but irrelevant. The once warm embraces were replaced by perfunctory pats on the shoulder, and my attempts to connect were met with polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. I overheard my daughter-in-law whispering to her sister about how Mom's getting a bit much these days, and I felt the sting of being labeled a burden, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The hardest part was the erasure of the history we shared, the wiping away of the years of love and sacrifice that had defined my role as a mother and grandmother. Family recipes I had passed down were replaced by store-bought shortcuts. Heirlooms I had carefully preserved were packed away or given away without a word, and photographs of my children as babies, once proudly displayed, vanished from the walls. It was as if the story of who I was and what I had done was being rewritten by others, leaving me out of the narrative entirely. The weight of this loss pressed down on me, a quiet but relentless pressure that sapped my strength and clouded my days with a pervasive sadness. Yet even as the walls closed in, a small part of me refused to be swallowed by the darkness. I found solace in the routine of caring for myself and my cats, in the simple pleasures of a good book or a warm cup of tea. I began to take walks around the neighborhood, noticing the way the light fell on the trees or the sound of children playing in the distance. These small moments reminded me that life still held beauty, even if the family I had known no longer saw me. I began to write again, filling pages with memories and reflections, reclaiming my voice in the quiet sanctuary of my own thoughts. It was during one of these walks that I found the courage to make a decision that would change everything. I visited a small secondhand shop that had recently opened nearby, drawn in by the promise of something new, something different. Among the shelves cluttered with forgotten treasures, I found 4 plastic litter boxes, clean, unused, and oddly beautiful in their simplicity. I bought them without hesitation, carrying them home as if they were precious jewels. I scrubbed them clean, lining them up in my garage, each one a symbol of the quiet rebellion growing within me. These litter boxes were not just containers. They were a statement, a promise to myself that I would no longer accept the scraps offered to me, that I would find a way to serve my own table on my own terms. The weeks that followed were a mix of fear and determination. When Bethany called unexpectedly, inviting me to Thanksgiving again, I said yes, but inside I knew that this time I would not be the silent victim. I reached out to June, my only true friend, asking if she could lend me a folding table and some freezer space. The act of preparing my own dishes on my own terms was an act of reclamation. It was a quiet defiance against the slow erasure, a declaration that I still mattered, that I still had something to give. I was ready to serve them a meal they would never forget. The moment when I began to turn the tide, when I first felt the stirrings of agency and the quiet rebellion that would carry me forward, was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by small, deliberate acts that slowly stitched together the frayed edges of my dignity. It was in the way I started to write things down, not for anyone else, but for myself. I bought a notebook with a plain leather cover and the word inventory embossed in gold letters across the front, a silent promise to hold myself accountable, to catalog not just what had been taken from me, but what I still had, the memories, the stories, the strength that had somehow endured beneath the weight of neglect and betrayal. Each evening I filled its pages with fragments of my life, the countless meals cooked and shared, the birthdays celebrated, the sacrifices made in silence. Writing became a ritual of reclamation, a way to remind myself that my life was not defined by their indifference, that I was still here, still whole, Around that same time, I found myself drawn to a secondhand shop that had opened on the corner of my street. It was a curious place, cluttered with objects that seemed to carry their own histories. Faded photographs, worn books, delicate china chipped at the edges, and curiosities collected from lives lived and forgotten. Among the shelves, I discovered 4 plastic litter boxes, clean and unused, their surfaces shining under the dusty light. It was an odd thing to buy, perhaps, but something about their simplicity and their starkness spoke to me. I bought them with my own money, carried them home with a quiet determination, and scrubbed them clean until they gleamed. I lined them up in my garage, a strange tableau that puzzled my neighbor when she stopped by to check on me. "What are those for?" she asked, eyebrows raised. I smiled, a slow, knowing smile that felt like a secret kept close. "They're for a project," I said, a promise. They were more than containers. They were symbols of a new chapter, a way to hold space for the dignity I refused to surrender. In the weeks that followed, I began to prepare for what I knew would be a confrontation, but one I was ready to face on my own terms. When Bethany called again, her voice hesitant but insistent, inviting me to another family gathering for Thanksgiving, I agreed, but with a calm resolve that surprised even me. I reached out to June, my only true friend and confidant, and asked if she could lend me a folding table and some freezer space. June did not ask questions. She simply said, "Of course," and offered a quiet strength that steadied me. The act of preparing my own dishes, cooking with care and intention, packing each meal into the litter boxes I had cleaned and lined with fresh cloth, was a sacred ritual. It was a declaration that I would no longer accept the scraps, the leftovers offered in contempt or neglect. I was ready to serve them a meal they would never forget, a feast that would hold a mirror to their cruelty. As I cooked, I found solace in the familiar rhythms of chopping, stirring, seasoning. The kitchen became my sanctuary, a place where the past and the present converged in the heat of the oven and the scent of rosemary and garlic. I made lasagna layered with rich tomato sauce and melted cheese, green beans almondine sprinkled with toasted almonds, candied yams glazed with brown sugar and butter, and a pumpkin pie that held the sweetness of autumn and memory. Each dish was carefully portioned into the litter boxes, lids sealed tight to keep the aroma intact, and packed into coolers for the journey. The act of preparing this meal was more than sustenance. It was a reclaiming of self-respect and an assertion of boundaries that had been ignored for too long. The day of the gathering arrived, and I dressed with care, wearing a blouse of soft blue and a scarf my mother had knitted decades ago. I carried the coolers with steady hands, each step toward Bethany's house a step away from the shadows that had held me captive. When I arrived, the usual flurry of activity greeted me, children running, voices raised in excitement, the clatter of preparations. But this time, I held my ground. I set up my folding table at the edge of the dining room, away from the main table where the family gathered, and placed the covered litter boxes in a neat row. The room fell into a hush, a collective breath held as eyes shifted toward the curious sight. Bethany approached, her face a mixture of confusion and thinly veiled anger. "What is this?" she asked, voice low but sharp. I looked at her steadily and said, "This is the meal you offered me last year." I lifted the lids one by one, revealing the carefully prepared dishes, each served in the clean litter boxes that had become symbols of the indignity I refused to endure again. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the shuffle of feet and whispered exclamations. The laughter and mockery of the past year were replaced by a stunned quiet, a reckoning that I did not need to voice with words. The food was good, better than anything they had prepared, and the gesture spoke volumes. I watched as faces shifted from shock to discomfort, some flushed with embarrassment, others hard with anger, but I did not waver. I let them absorb the message in their own time. In the days that followed, I felt a shift within myself that no words could fully capture. The act of standing up, of serving my own meal in a way that could not be ignored, ignited a flame of confidence and self-worth that had long been smothered. I realized that reclaiming my dignity was not about making others understand or apologize, but about honoring myself and the life I had lived. The litter boxes remained in my garage for a time, a reminder of the moment I stopped waiting for validation and began living for myself. It was the midpoint of my journey, the turning point where silence gave way to voice, invisibility to presence, and resignation to quiet rebellion. From here, the path would not be easy, but it would be mine to walk. The days that followed my silent yet unmistakable declaration with the litter boxes were a strange mixture of calm and storm, of outward peace and inward turmoil, of hope flickering alongside the shadows of past wounds that refused to fully heal. It was as if the air itself had shifted, carrying with it the heavy weight of unspoken tensions and the fragile tremors of change. The family, for the first time in years, was aware that the woman they had tried to erase was no longer willing to disappear quietly, and their reactions came in waves, some hesitant, some sharp, some wrapped in the guise of concern but laced with control. The quiet rebellion I had begun was now a living thing, stirring old fears and resentments, but also opening cracks through which light might enter. It started with a letter from Kieran, my eldest grandson, the one whose gentle spirit had always been a balm to my weary heart. His handwriting was uneven, a mix of youthful hope and uncertain courage, but the words were clear and sincere. He wrote of missing me, of not understanding why I had withdrawn, and of wanting to reconnect without the weight of past grievances hanging over us. His letter arrived on a morning thick with mist, slipped quietly under my door by the postman, whose face held a knowing kindness. I held the letter close for a long time, feeling the soft warmth of connection amid the cold distances that had grown between us. Kieran was the one thread left unbroken in the tapestry of my fractured family, and his reaching out was both a gift and a challenge. It was a reminder that even in the depths of estrangement, the possibility of healing remained, but the peace was short-lived. Not long after, Bethany appeared at my doorstep, her face pale and drawn, her eyes searching but guarded. She did not come with the warmth of a daughter seeking reconciliation, but with the cold formality of a negotiator. "We're hosting Thanksgiving again," she said, voice carefully measured. "We'd like you to come early, help with the preparations, like always." There was an edge to her words, a tension that spoke of expectations unspoken and conditions attached. I looked at her steadily and replied, "I'll come, but this time I will not be invisible." She did not respond, only nodded, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her expression. Soon after, a man in a suit came to visit, a stranger who introduced himself as Derek Sorensen, the lawyer hired by my children to discuss my well-being and assets. His presence was a cold reminder of the power dynamics at play, the way concern could be wielded as a weapon to control and confine. Derek spoke carefully, using phrases like safe environment and next steps, words that felt like chains disguised as care. I listened without interruption, folding my hands calmly in my lap. When he finished, I told him plainly that I was of sound mind, living in a place I chose, and that I did not require supervision or interference. I handed him a letter I had prepared, stating my position clearly and firmly, and told him that any further contact under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. He left without another word, blinking in the light as I closed the door behind him. The arrival of the lawyer was soon followed by an article in the local newspaper, a carefully crafted piece portraying me as a missing matriarch, a woman who had disappeared without a word, stirring public concern and family statements filled with carefully calibrated worry and pleas for my return. The article quoted Adam and Bethany, painting a picture of anxiety and vulnerability that felt as false as it was cruel. I kept the clipping not out of sentimentality, but as proof of the lengths they would go to maintain control, to rewrite the story so that I was the one at fault, the one who caused pain by choosing herself. The neighborhood cafe where I worked was filled with whispers and sideways glances as the article circulated, and I met those eyes without shame or apology. If this was the narrative they chose to tell, I would live outside its frame, on my own terms. During this turbulent time, my connection with Kieran deepened. He called often, his voice carrying the tentative hope of a boy reaching out across a canyon. We spoke of small things, the books he was reading, the music he loved, the quiet moments that made life bearable, and of bigger things too, though never with pressure or accusation. Kieran never asked when I might return or why I had left. Instead, he offered presence, a steady light in the fog of family drama. Our conversations became a lifeline, reminding me that love could exist beyond the boundaries others set. I told him I was safe and that I was building a life of my own, one not defined by their expectations or judgments. He understood, and in that understanding, we found a fragile peace. Bethany's visits became less frequent, but more pointed. She came once with an envelope, a thin attempt at mediation wrapped in the guise of a gift. Inside were letters from family members, appeals disguised as apologies, and offers of conditional acceptance. I took the envelope without anger, but I told her firmly that Kieran was capable of reaching out himself and that I did not need intermediaries. The space between us was wide, filled with years of hurt and silence, but I refused to step back into the roles they assigned me. I was no longer the mother who sacrificed without question or the grandmother who existed only to serve. I was a woman who had found her voice and would not be silenced. Throughout this period, I continued to build my new life, steady and slow. I worked at the cafe, earning my own money, feeling the simple pride of independence with every paycheck I collected. The warmth of the kitchen, the rhythm of service, and the quiet camaraderie with Heather, the manager, grounded me in the present. My days were filled with small joys, walking in the neighborhood, tending to the cats who came and went like faithful friends, reading books that fed my soul. I bought myself a navy wool coat from a secondhand store, a symbol of my reclamation, something that fit not just my body, but my new identity. Each step I took away from the past was a step toward freedom. Yet the past was never far behind. There were moments when the phone rang with numbers I did not recognize, messages left that carried the weight of expectation and guilt. The letters continued to arrive, some sharp with anger, others laced with sorrow and regret. But I did not respond. I held my boundaries firmly, knowing that healing required space and time, and that some bridges could only be crossed when both sides were willing. I wrote my own letters, too, not to the family, but to myself and to those who had supported me, June, Heather, and even Kieran. These letters were acts of affirmation, reminders of my worth and my right to choose my path. The crescendo of this second escalation came unexpectedly, with the arrival of Lisa, Bethany's sister-in-law, at the cafe. She appeared one gray afternoon, her presence sharp and unfamiliar, standing stiffly by the pastry display. Heather spotted her first and warned me quietly. Lisa did not come to offer reconciliation, but to attempt control, to draw me back into the web of family drama on their terms. I let her wait, finishing my tasks with deliberate calm before approaching. We spoke quietly in a corner booth, a conversation fraught with unspoken accusations and tentative admissions. Lisa confessed to the panic and chaos of the past year, the frustration of managing children and appearances, and the fear of losing control. Her words were weary, small, and for the first time, genuine. But they were not enough to undo the damage or erase the years of neglect. I told her I was no longer the shadow they cast behind closed doors, no longer the woman who waited silently for approval or acceptance. I was my own person now, and I had learned to stand without them. Lisa left without finishing her coffee, and I watched her go with a quiet sense of closure. That night, I sat with June on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the chill, and we spoke of endings and beginnings. She asked gently if I would see them again. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I'll see Kieran, but on my time." June nodded, understanding that some ties are chosen and some are broken, and that freedom sometimes means walking away from what you thought was forever. The day I decided to send the final letter was the day I truly stepped across the line from being a silent victim to becoming a woman who claimed her power back in full. It wasn't a day marked by fanfare or public announcement, but a quiet morning bathed in soft sunlight filtering through the curtains of my small bungalow. The kitchen table was cluttered with papers, drafts, and discarded sentences, my pen poised over the crisp sheet where my words would finally take shape. I thought about everything that had led me here: the betrayals, the silences, the slow unraveling of the family ties I once believed unbreakable. But I also thought about the life I was building now, fragile and new, a life forged from pain, but tempered by resilience. This letter would be my boundary and my declaration, clear and unyielding. I wrote to Derek Sorensen, the lawyer, the man who had come between me and my family with his carefully crafted concerns and thinly veiled threats. The letter was succinct but firm, a legal statement wrapped in the calm assurance of a woman who knew her rights and her worth. I stated that I was of sound mind, living safely and independently, and that any further attempts to interfere in my life would be regarded as harassment. I made it clear that I had retained legal counsel of my own, and that I was no longer willing to be controlled or questioned under the guise of care. The act of writing these words felt like shedding an old skin, like stepping out of a shadow that had clung to me for too long. I sealed the envelope with steady hands and placed it in the mailbox, a small but irreversible step toward freedom. The letter to Lisa, my daughter, came next. It was shorter, less formal, but no less powerful. 3 lines carefully chosen. "I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now." These words were not written in bitterness or revenge, but in finality. They were a closing of a chapter that had been left open far too long. I addressed the wounds without demanding explanations or apologies. I was done waiting for recognition or remorse that might never come. This letter was my farewell to the past that had hurt me, and my affirmation that my future would be mine alone to shape. When Lisa arrived at the cafe later that week, it was unexpected and unsettling. She stood stiffly by the pastry display, the polished coat and carefully styled hair, making her look like she belonged in a different world than the one I inhabited. Heather noticed her first and gave me a quiet warning. I let Lisa wait, continuing my work with deliberate calm, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me rattled or surprised. When I finally approached, we spoke in the quiet corner booth, away from prying eyes and ears. The conversation was tense, fraught with years of unspoken grievances and the fragile hope for understanding that neither of us was sure how to reach. Lisa spoke of panic and chaos, of the difficulty of managing children and appearances, and the fear of losing control. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, less certain, and for a fleeting moment I saw the woman behind the mask, the woman who, like me, had been caught in a web of expectations and disappointments. But no matter how genuine her words, the damage was done. I told her plainly that I was no longer the shadow lurking in the corners of their lives, no longer the woman who waited in silence for permission to exist. I was my own person now, with boundaries that would not be crossed and a life that did not revolve around their needs or opinions. I reminded her gently that the love and sacrifices of the past did not bind me to roles I no longer accepted. Lisa left without finishing her coffee, her face a mixture of frustration and resignation. I watched her go, feeling a quiet sense of closure settle over me. That evening, wrapped in blankets on the porch with June, I let the weight of the day fall away beneath the soft glow of streetlights and the scent of rain lingering in the air. We spoke in hushed tones of endings and beginnings, of the courage it takes to walk away from what you thought was forever and to embrace the unknown. June asked if I would see them again. I shook my head slowly and said, "No, I'll see Kieran, but only on my time." She nodded, understanding that some ties are chosen and some are broken, and that true freedom sometimes means walking alone. In the weeks that followed, the new life I had fought so hard to claim began to solidify. The cafe became a place of steady routine and quiet friendships, a sanctuary where my worth was measured by the work I did and the respect I earned, not by blood or obligation. I wore my navy wool coat with pride. Each button fastened a reminder of the boundaries I had set and the dignity I had reclaimed. I took long walks through the neighborhood, savoring the way the light fell through the trees and the sound of birdsong filled the air. The cats who visited my porch became companions in a life rebuilt on my own terms. Yet even as I embraced this new chapter, I carried the echoes of the past with me. Letters unopened, calls unanswered, the lingering ache of family ties frayed but not fully severed. I learned that healing is not a straight path, but a winding road, marked by moments of doubt and courage, loss and hope. The act of saying no, of drawing lines in the sand, was not the end, but a powerful beginning. It was a reclaiming of self in a world that too often tries to diminish us with silence and neglect. Looking back, I see that day, the day I wrote those final letters, not as a moment of anger or defeat, but as a quiet victory. It was the moment I stopped waiting for others to define my worth and began to define it for myself. It was the day I served myself the respect I had always deserved and decided that I would never again accept anything less. And in that decision, I found not just freedom, but peace. The quiet after the storm settled over my life like a soft blanket, warming the parts that had been chilled for so long. The days began to blend together, not in a haze of confusion or loneliness, but in a steady rhythm of purpose and peace. I woke each morning in my small bungalow, the air filled with the gentle sounds of birdsong and the distant hum of life outside my window. My kitchen smelled of fresh herbs and simmering broth, and the cats who had become my companions stretched and purred at my feet. This was a life rebuilt, not on the shaky foundations of old family ties that had cracked and crumbled, but on the solid ground of self-respect and choice. I was no longer waiting for invitations or apologies. I was creating my own invitations and finding joy in the ordinary moments that made life worth living. One afternoon, I received a letter from Kieran. His handwriting had grown steadier, more confident, and his words carried the warmth of someone who had found his own footing in the world, but had not forgotten where he came from. He wrote of his new job at a bookstore, the small victories and quiet pleasures of a life spent among books and people who understood him. He spoke of missing me, of wanting to visit, but also of respecting the space I had asked for. I read his letter by the window, the soft light casting gentle shadows on the page, and I felt a swell of tenderness and hope. This was not the grand reunion of fairy tales, but something quieter and more real, a beginning built on honesty and mutual respect. I did visit him at the motel where he stayed during a short trip to town. We sat together in the small room, surrounded by stacks of books and the hum of a television playing softly in the background. There were no grand speeches or dramatic tears, just the steady presence of two people reconnecting in their own time. He showed me the poems he had underlined, the ones that reminded him of me, and I felt the fragile bridge between us strengthen with each shared smile and gentle word. It was a meeting not of demands or expectations, but of quiet understanding and the kind of love that waits patiently for wounds to heal. Back in my bungalow, the rhythm of my days continued to grow richer. I took long walks through the neighborhood, savoring the way the light fell on the trees and the scent of lilacs in the air. I tended to the garden, planting bulbs that would bloom in the spring, a symbol of the new life I was cultivating. The cafe where I worked became a place of steady friendship and respect, where Heather and I shared quiet jokes and the satisfaction of a job well done. The navy wool coat I had bought for myself hung by the door, a daily reminder of the woman I had become, strong, dignified, and unafraid to stand alone. One evening, June and I attended a community potluck at the local church basement. It was a gathering of neighbors, most of whom I had never met, but who welcomed me with smiles and warm conversation. I brought a sweet potato cake, a recipe handed down from my mother, and as I shared it around the table, I felt a sense of belonging that was new and unexpected. We laughed and talked about everything and nothing, the noise and chatter filling the room like a balm to my soul. For the first time in years, I was part of something that did not ask for proof of my worth, something that accepted me simply because I was. At home that night, wrapped in a quilt and listening to the soft breathing of the cats curled at my feet, I wrote a letter to myself. I taped it inside my dresser drawer, a secret message to the woman who had waited too long for someone to save her. "You held the key all along," I wrote. "They let go first, and you finally let go back. Look at the life that opened. Well done." The words felt like a benediction, a closing of one chapter and the opening of another, filled with promise. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I think of Bethany and the others, of the life I left behind and the pain that came with it. But I do not carry anger or bitterness anymore. I carry peace, a hard-won, steady peace that comes from knowing I chose myself when no one else would. I know that not all wounds heal, and not all relationships mend, but I also know that the most important relationship I have is the one I have with myself. This is my story, a story not of defeat, but of quiet strength, not of endings, but of new beginnings. If my journey reaches you in a moment when you feel small or forgotten, know this: you are not alone. You have the power to step away from the shadows and into the light of your own making. You have the right to be seen, to be heard, and to be loved, not as an obligation or an afterthought, but as the whole, worthy person you are. When you are ready, take that step. And when you do, come back and tell me. I'll be here, listening, waiting, and cheering you on.